Good afternoon, everybody. So to kind of set the stage a little bit, we're going to talk a little more in depth about hacking, about attacks, about the impact to the maritime industry, to super yachts in particular, right? How many people feel like they have a good understanding of how hackers operate? A few hands, right? So for the cybersecurity experts in the room, right? This might be a little more high level, but I will go as deep as you guys want me to go, right? The first thing I want to do though is I kind of want to set the stage and make sure everybody's aware that hacking does not happen like we see in Hollywood, like we see in the movies, right?
There's a new virus in the database.
What's happening?
It's replicating, eating up memory. What do I do?
Type cookie, you idiot.
I don't think I've ever seen Cookie Monster on the screen of a compromised computer, right?
We have a zero bug attacking all login and overlay files.
Run antivirus. Give me a systems display.
We wish it looked this cool when we were combating attackers. It really is not this cool, I promise you.
Rabbit is in the administration system.
Send a flu shot.
Rabbit, flu shot, someone talk to me.
A rabbit replicates till it overloads a file, then it spreads like cancer.
Cancer?
Although the confusion can be about that real, even if it doesn't look this cool. And we definitely it doesn't look like we're flying through the computers when we're hacking systems, right? That's again, we wish it looked that cool, but it's more command line.
Man, there's too many garbage files. I need more time.
Frequently, when we're working on the computer, when we're hacking, when we're creating code, right? We might have music playing, but I don't see 3D images coming together that form the virus, right? But we do dance when we create something awesome.
No way. I'm getting hacked.
A port scan?
No.
Rarely do you see that much activity on the screen when an attack is happening. And just because you type faster on the keyboard doesn't mean that you're going to combat the attacker any faster.
Oh, this is not good.
And definitely have I never ever seen two people typing on the same keyboard at the same time help anything.
It would take months to get built. What is that, video game?
No, Tony, we're getting hacked.
They get in Abby's computer, the entire NCIS network is next.
I can't stop him. Do something, McGee.
I've never seen code like this. Ah, where'd it go, Abby?
I didn't do anything. I thought you did.
No. I did.
So much like how Gibbs pulled the plug on that attack, let's pull the plug on how Hollywood demonstrates attacks, right? Because that's not how it really happens, as much as that can be entertaining, right? So this isn't Hollywood, this is the real world. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time together today talking about cybersecurity, cyber attacks. What are the threats? How do the attackers operate? How does this impact the maritime industry and specifically the super yacht industry, right? As a whole. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what it is that you can do, right? We want you to walk away from this workshop with an understanding that you're not hopeless against the attackers, right? There are actions you can take. There are things you can do. There are guidelines that you can implement in order to better protect yourself. So we're going to talk through that. We're going to talk through our recommendations, and then I'm going to open it up for questions and answers at the end for whatever is stirring up there that you're dying to ask, right? So who am I and why am I up here talking to you? I'm Eric Stride. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for Atlas Cybersecurity. We are a cybersecurity company that focuses in on two markets. One is small and medium-sized business, and the second is the super yachts and protecting the crews, the owners, captains and the associated industry. And we're going to talk about how your typical solutions that you see most cybersecurity companies kind of pushing out there do not apply directly to this industry. My background, I spent 12 years in the U.S. Air Force as a cyber warfare officer. I spent 5 years at the National Security Agency, and I've been in the private sector for the last 5 years. Spent the first chunk of that time as the Senior VP for Research and Development for another cybersecurity company, looking at how do I create technologies that can identify and stop the advanced attacker, right? Because a lot of the solutions that we have out there just don't go after the advanced attacker not well, right? How do we hunt them down? How do we prevent them from causing damage to you and to our clients, right? And really, because of my experience in the federal space, I'm really able to identify and understand how the attacker operates, right? So take that experience protecting those kinds of networks and apply it to the private space here. Have a handful of industry certifications as well. It just means I've been through a lot of training and I've taken a lot of tests, right? But really understand this. These behaviors, the attacker behavior, really well as a result of that experience. So obviously, cybersecurity is a big topic for Superyachts, right? We're talking about it right now, right? It was a subject of the keynote session earlier, right? If we take a look at the headlines that have been coming out over the last couple of years, there's lots of attention grabbers about oh, hey, I could break into this super yacht in 30 minutes, right? I hacked into the VSAT. I spoofed the GPS, right? The electronic charting and navigation system got infected, right? What can we do about this, right? But it's important to realize that the risk is not just the yacht, right? It's the whole industry, right? So of course the vessel is the center of this, but the management company, right? Your third-party vendors, the ports, if you connect up to their network, then as we talked about earlier, right? The crew, the owners, the guests, the charter customers, right? You've got devices that the crew brings on, right? They've got their personal laptops, they've got their personal cell phones, they're connecting to the Wi-Fi. The owners and the guests are as well, right? And there's some unique challenges there, right? So earlier I talked about the hacker trends in the space, and since we're talking about the industry as a whole, not just the vessel, let's start there, right? With the organizations like the management companies, like your third-party vendors, like your suppliers, right? And what are some of those risks? And as for those of you that were in the session earlier, you saw me mention this, right? But a small and medium-sized business is about up to 1,000 people and up to $1 billion in revenue, right? Which means there's a lot of small and medium-sized businesses out there, and that probably encompasses most of this industry, right? And for those of you who were not there, we talked about how small and medium-sized businesses typically have an approach that says, hey, why would they come after me? Why would they target me? I'm not, a JP Morgan Chase. I'm not Air France, right? I'm not Zara. I'm not some big corporation, right? And from the attacker's perspective, right, that think like the attacker mentality that I told you I was able to glean from my government time and my time in research and development, the attackers, you want the biggest return on their investment, the biggest bang for their buck, right? And if they're always targeting the large corporations who have lots of money invested in cybersecurity, who have a mature security operations center, who have the processes to identify and thwart the attackers, they're not going to be as successful. They're not going to make as much money off of it if that's their goal, right? And so as a result of this, we see that the statistics show us that about 50% of attacks actually target small and medium-sized businesses. And when you go and survey a lot of small and medium-sized businesses, 2/3 of them say that they've suffered some kind of cyber attack in the last 12 months, right? Whether that's a breach of customer data, right? Whether they've been a victim of ransomware, whether they've fallen victim to a CEO fraud or business email compromise, right? Where the attackers try to get them to transfer money to somewhere that they shouldn't, right? They've suffered some kind of a cyber attack, right? The average cost here, as the slide says, is about $3 million. And it's important to realize that cost incorporates a lot more than just your direct costs, but your indirect costs as well, right? So yes, there's the cost of additional manpower, bringing people in on the weekends to try to resolve the issue of installing new systems, replacing systems if you have to, right? If you have to bring in an outside vendor, but then of course, the downtime, right? What is the impact to your organization, right? What's the impact to the shipbuilder if they have to pause, a build for 2 weeks while they bring their systems back up, right? What's the impact to you as a supplier or as a management company if you don't have your computer systems available for 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, right? Charter company can't send out a yacht for 2 weeks, right? What's the impact to the bottom line, right? And that's where this number really starts to grow. That $3 million is that downtime. So, think about, internalize that for a moment. How well protected is not just the vessel, but the management companies, your organizations, right? The offices that you have, right? What kind of impact would a breach of that supply chain, of that ecosystem have on your organization, of one of your partners? Now, while we're talking about the trends in the offices, it is important to realize, right? A yacht is not an office, right? There's a lot of differences, right? In a typical office, right, you have fairly fixed schedules, right? It tends to be an 8 to 5 operation, right? You have fixed internet connectivity, how you connect. Your security posture might be a little easier to maintain because your office isn't moving, right? And when you compare that to the yacht, right? You've got the rotation of the crew, just as the captain said in the session this morning, for the really large vessels, right? They're gonna have 100% crew change out in about 2 years, right? Most organizations, most businesses don't experience 100% turnover in a 2-year time frame, right? Most organizations, most offices aren't going to have internet connectivity that changes as frequently as it does on a yacht, right? Excuse me. From when they're on when they're docked and they're connected to shoreline, when they're on Wi-Fi, okay, now they're on 4G, and then a majority of the time when they're out and about and they're on VSAT, right? Low bandwidth, high latency type connection, right? An office doesn't have those same kind of challenges. So while some of the trends are similar between a yacht and an office, it's important to realize they're not identical, right? You have to have solutions that are custom to the yachting environment in order to be effective. So let's dig a little deeper about the attacker, right? Who are they, right? So we talked about Hollywood's persona of an attacker, right? But what do you guys think about when you think about a cyber attacker or a cyber hacker, right? Anybody? What do you think about? Over here, somebody. Shout it out. Data theft? Okay. What else do you guys think about when you think about an attacker, right? Money. Right? Financial motive. Some people think about the hooded attacker, right? Some people think about what we like to call in the industry the script kiddie in mommy and daddy's basement, right? Who's just downloading tools, doesn't really understand the attacks, but's just going to try to execute those scripts and hope that they get something, right? Some folks, some attackers, right? They initiate attacks for bragging rights, right? Some are going to be nation-state actors who are breaking into systems for intelligence purposes. Most of these don't apply to the super yachts, right? You're not going to typically have the script kiddie in mama's basement who's hitting the super yacht, right? You're typically, I'll say typically not going to have your nation-state intelligence operative going after a super yacht. There might be some exceptions depending on who the clientele is, right? But the primary attacker that we're going to see in this industry are those with a financial motive, right? This is typically your cyber criminals, right? They see breaking into these systems as an opportunity to make some money, right? And how do they leverage the attack in order to put money in their pocket, right? A few ways that they might do that, right? They might do that through ransomware. They might do that through that business email compromise we were talking about, where they try to trick you into transferring money, right? They might just steal your information and try to sell it to others, right? There's a few different approaches that they'll take here, right? So we see a lot of financial motive in this market. Let's talk briefly about targeted versus untargeted attack or non-targeted attacks. And this was alluded to a little bit in the session this morning. but all of the information that we put out there online can be useful, right? The attackers who've decided to target a particular organization, they're going to go out and do what we call open source research. They're going to see, what information do you have that's online about your organization, about your vessel, about your supply chain, right? Maybe your broker has a video up of the vessel, and it shows the engine room, and the attacker can figure out what kind of systems you have, right? They're going to try to glean as much information as they can, right? Maybe you're advertising jobs for a particular skill set, right? And that might let them know that, hey, these are the types of equipment that you have on board because you're advertising for those types of engineers, right? What kind of security tools, right? So if that information is out there and is public, or if they can identify your IP range and scan it up, right, they might be able to identify that. And then from that social media aspect, right? What kind of information is available about the crew, right? So for a lot of these boats, right, there's websites like, superyachtfan.com, right, where you can find a bunch of information about the boats, about the crew, about the owners, right? The attacker is going to take all of this open source information, and they're really trying to create a profile of how do I break in, right? How can I get into this network if they've decided to target you, right? And would they target super yachts? Right. I would say absolutely. So again, if their motive is financial, right? You have high net worth individuals who own, who use, who charter these vessels, right? If I can, as an attacker, can get access to that, that sounds like a prime target to me, right? So high return on investment targets from the attacker's perspective, right? The VSAT connectivity, right, makes it a little bit lower of an investment. It's a little bit easier for me to find high-value targets or interesting targets as an attacker because I can identify those corporations, those companies that run these VSAT networks, right? I can scan those IP address ranges, and anything that I find that's connected to a VSAT's probably an interesting target. It might be a super yacht. It might be some kind of industrial control system. But from an attacker's perspective, whoever it is probably has money because VSATs aren't cheap either, right? And as we just talked about a moment ago, right, high value return based on who's on board, right? We talked about this earlier too in the session, but how many of the devices on board get updated regularly? Probably few, right? How many get the passwords changed on a regular basis, right? Is the password the same as it has been since the build, since the refit, right? Is the Wi-Fi network extended way out onto the dock, and every member of the crew for the last 5 years knows what the Wi-Fi password is and can just sit out there on the dock and gain access, right? So there's a lot of network maintenance that does not happen, and that frequently it's because cybersecurity especially is not at the forefront of the focus of the crew, right? They're really focused on making sure the yacht is operational, that the owner and the guests are taken care of, right? The physical maintenance, they might have to help, the ETO might be worried about an AV system today, an IT system tomorrow, and this afternoon they're helping in the engine room with cleanup or repair of something, right? Taking legal action against the attackers also can be very complicated because you have different rules and different laws that apply, right? You might be sailing in one jurisdiction, but you're flagged out of another, and how easy is it for law enforcement to get involved, right? So does this ring true for many of you, for your organizations or for your yachts, right? So let's talk about a couple of example attacks, right? Some of these you might have heard about before, but it's important to realize, right? Attacks will happen to owners, right? I think one of the gentlemen in the back in the morning session actually talked about this very similar scenario, right? An attacker broke in to an organization. They used a spear phishing email to get into the network, right? Got the user to either click the link or open the attachment. They got access to the email system into the network. They started monitoring the emails that were going back and forth. They realized that the owner was getting ready to make a purchase, and there was going to be an exchange of money, right? And they waited for the email that said that, hey, yep, we're going to go ahead and go forward with this. And they provided an email that said, hey, here are the wire instructions to complete the transaction, right? By monitoring the emails, this was a completely expected I'll say expected, right? Obviously not from the attacker, but an expected email, right? And so from the owner's perspective, right? Yep, absolutely. Let's go forward and do this, right? And they transferred $11 million off to the wrong organization. So in a situation like this, there's more than just technical controls that can help thwart this kind of activity, right? Technical controls can help identify that they've broken in and they're establishing and maintaining communication surveillance. Training of the crew and of the owners can help identify phishing emails, right? There are some technical controls to identify emails that come from outside the network and that may be potentially risky, right? So there's some technical controls there, but then there's also procedural controls when it comes down to making financial transactions over a certain amount, right? Hey, what is your policy if a transfer request exceeds a certain amount? Do you verify it out of band through another type of communication mechanism other than email, and not using the phone number that's in the email, right, itself? Having that second review, that second validation, right, can help avoid these kinds of scenarios. In addition to the owners, right, this kind of stuff also happens to the crew, right? And this example, I think I talked about on stage during the morning session, right? But I know a captain personally who this happened to, right? Who, they went into port, they got fuel, he expected the invoice, he got an invoice, he didn't notice that the domain name that it came from was not the correct domain name. They had they had changed one of the letters, one of the characters, right? It might have been replaced an L with a 1 kind of deal. We call this a typo squatting domain, right? The attackers do this intentionally because they know that this fuel vendor sends out invoices over email. They make their fake invoice look just like a legitimate invoice, but they put their routing information on there for the payment, right? Captain made the payment. He ended up out about $450,000 from the one that I know of personally here. So it can be very, very expensive. And then, of course, the guests, right? The guests have threats here as well. This is the one that we were made aware of about a ship's camera system being compromised, of course, through the network. They were able to take images, download those images, and then they attempted to blackmail the owner and the guests, right? So, how many of these scenarios seem realistic to you, your organization, your yachts, right? Very realistic threats. So, let's talk a moment about how the attacker actually breaks in, right? What is it that they do? We talked about the fake bills, fake invoices. That's a pretty popular tactic today, right? The stats show, a little over 15% of them tend to come from there. Fake email delivery failure notices, right? We've probably all seen these, right? Hey, I just tried to email Bob, came back, right? Yep, this email address isn't valid, right? You open it up, you click the link or you open the attachment, right? And you get compromised that way. Fake package delivery emails, DHL, FedEx, UPS, right? Oh, hey, we tried to deliver your package, right? Click here for redelivery instructions, right? Or to schedule redelivery, click here, right? Big one that we've seen on the other side of the pond is the fake legal law enforcement notices. Hey, we are the IRS, and we've opened an investigation into you. Hey, this is the FBI. We've opened an investigation. You need to give us a call back, right? And try to get people to install software, open an attachment, or in some of them it's get them to buy gift cards and pay them via iTunes gift cards, right? A much smaller one, but we do see it, is emulating a scan document. How many people have used a multifunction device, right? You got that printer, copier, scanner, big device. You pop it in. You can say, hey, scan this, send it to me as an email attachment, right? And it shoots it over to you. All right, we've seen attackers using that mechanism to try to trick people, right? This is all a part of basically social engineering, right? And we see that attackers use social engineering more than 90% of the time in order to try to break in. Right? Technical controls have gotten better over the last few years. And so the attackers focus on the weakest link, which is the human, right? How can we trick you into doing something that helps us, right? How do I get you to click the link? How do I get you to open the attachment, right? And that really is the primary focus that they use. Of those, another 92% actually require an attachment to be opened, and almost half of those are Office files, right? So you get sent an Office file that says, hey, here are the pay raises for 2020, right? It's very tempting to open, right? You open it up and it says, oh, this is a protected document. In order to view the contents, you have to click Enable Macros, and it's got a giant arrow pointing to the button, right? Once they click that Enable Macros button, it allows the Office document to run embedded code, and now the attacker has their presence on the machine, right? Outside of attacking people, we do see attackers leveraging what I call the exploit of the day, right? And so this time last year, we saw that the vast majority of ransomware actually got in by leveraging Remote Desktop Protocol, RDP. Why was that popular this time last year? Because a pair of Remote Desktop Protocol exploits, RDP exploits, were published to the greater InfoSec community. A couple that were allegedly tied back to a three-letter intelligence agency, right? And so they would use these with the hopes that people haven't patched their systems yet, right? Because as soon as these become public, the IT providers, the service providers, the OS in this case, this would be Microsoft, right? They're going to quickly try to spin out a patch, right? Try to update the systems, or at least make a patch available. But if the end users don't ever install those updates, they're never protected from these vulnerabilities, right? Excuse me. And we saw it this time last year, literally over, I want to say it was over 2.5 million exposed RDP sessions to the internet, right? That's a lot of potential victims, right? And from the attacker's perspective, hey, that's a lot of computers I might be able to break into that don't require me to have a user click on something. I can just go hit it from the internet, right? So talking a little bit about the attackers' tools and about how they hit the maritime industry, and then as a subset, the yachting industry, right? We're going to go a little more technical for those of you who want more technical details on this slide. I'll try not to lose those of you who are not super technical, right? But the most popular malware types, right? These are the tools that the attackers use in order to try to make money off of their attacks, right? Ransomware has been popular for years, right? A few years ago, it was more popular against individuals, right? We've actually we have seen that change in the last year or so. The number of attacks against individuals is actually down about 12% last year to this year, but the number of attacks of ransomware against businesses is up about 300% from last year to this year, right? So ransomware against businesses is huge, right? And I think there's an N missing there. I gotta figure that ransomware. No, that's good. Okay. At any rate, ransomware. How many people are familiar with ransomware? You don't have to admit if you've been hit, right? How many think it's easier to pay than to try to restore from backup, right? Which then leads to the next question, right? How many in this industry have good backups? Yeah. So how many yachts have good backups? A couple, right? Not many, though. So what happens if ransomware hits the yacht, right? If there's no good backups, right? Maybe you're reinstalling the operating system from scratch, right? Or maybe you end up paying it because you want to resolve it quicker, right? Cyber insurance is a factor here, right? How many folks are familiar with cyber insurance, right? How many folks actually have cyber insurance, right? So a couple of items there, right? Read the exclusions, right? We know of one last year where the insurance company actually refused to pay because the attack was attributed to a nation-state government, and the insurance company said, oh, that's an act of hostilities by a foreign actor in a time of peace or war. That's an exclusion. We're not paying, right? But ransomware is an interesting one with the insurance companies, right? Because they're going to look at, hey, what does it cost for you to get your systems back up, right? And if it is cheaper to pay the ransom than it is to restore the system, the insurance company might tell you, hey, you know what, if you pay the ransom, we'll pay out because it's cheaper for them than to pay for you to do a restore that takes a couple of weeks, right? Hopefully it doesn't take you a couple of weeks if all your backups are good and everything else. But the insurance companies are an interesting factor there. Crypto miners is another one. People familiar with crypto miners? So how many people are familiar with cryptocurrency? All right, so much higher number, right? So cryptocurrency, right, is generated by basically crunching away on hard math problems, right? And as the computer works on those math problems, it can generate crypto coin, right? Bitcoin, Litecoin, some kind of altcoin, right? That's a process called mining, right? By executing these algorithms and figuring out these math problems, they generate more of that cryptocurrency. Attackers have figured out that, hey, if I can get my mining algorithm onto somebody else's computer, I can leverage their computer and their electricity to try to make me money, right? And so that is one that we have seen used significantly. It went down a bit last year when the price of Bitcoin dropped significantly, but it is starting to pick back up. Info stealers is one that I consider a pretty grave risk to a lot of folks, right? Because this one kind of pairs with the stealth attacker that I have down at the bottom, hand in hand. So the info stealers, right? It is malware that is placed on a system designed to be hidden, right? That is looking for sensitive information, right? Credit card data, banking information, your social security number if you're an American, right? Your passport information, right? Your health information, maybe business secrets, right? Trade secrets. If you're in charge of a high frequency trading company, maybe your algorithm for high frequency trading, right? The Colonel's secret recipe to Kentucky Fried Chicken, whatever you have that's of value that the criminals can try to monetize, they're going to try to steal that information. And in turn, they end up selling it on the forums on the dark web, right? Because they can turn that into money, and there are people that are willing to buy that information to try to use it either against you or for financial gain. Adware, right? Everybody's heard of adware, right? Adware's been around for decades now. These are, pieces of malware that end up on your system that try to, display ads, and they try to make money off showing you the ads, right? At the lowest risk level, it's slowing down your system, right? I'll say the higher risk potential for these is that it's an initial access mechanism, right? A lot of them have command and control servers that they reach out to. It says, hey, what ads do you want me to display, right? Those can then be leveraged and sold to others to install more sophisticated malware, right? So while adware by itself, if it's only doing adware, tends to be a low risk threat vector, the installation of adware and the leveraging of it to install additional malware is a much higher risk, right? And we see with most ransomware today that ransomware is not the initial attack vector, right? Typically, the victim's already been infected with something else, right? Maybe they got infected with adware. Maybe they got infected with a banking Trojan, right? And they decided, you know what? Hey, I'm just going to go ahead and leverage all this access to launch a bunch of malware attacks to try to make money that way, right? Credential stuffing attacks. Anybody know what this is? All right, so I got a lot of blank stares. I got at least one hand. All right, thanks. So credential stuffing attacks. How many people in here use the same password for more than one site? Right? We're almost all guilty because we're human, right? And it's really hard to remember all these complex passwords, right? Highly recommend that you go and look at password managers and try to implement them, right? Because when you use the same username and password on more than one site, you've exposed yourself to any of those sites being compromised can potentially compromise all of your accounts that use that same username and password, right? So you've got a subscription to your favorite magazine, right? And you log in online to pay for it, to look at the electronic edition, and you use the same username and password there that you use on your banking site, right? Or that you use at work, or that you use to VPN into the Superyacht that you have access to, right? If that magazine site gets compromised, the credentials get stolen, right? Especially if they're not storing them in a secure manner, which doesn't happen as often as we would like. The attackers, they're going to take those lists of username and passwords, those email and password combinations, and they're just going to try them everywhere they can, right? Because a significant number of people reuse passwords in multiple locations, and if you have an account both here on this magazine site and on the bank where they're trying to stuff the credentials into, and you use the same username and password, they just got access to your banking site because they compromised your magazine subscription company, right? Business email compromise, I've probably talked about twice today, so I'm not going to spend more time harping on that, but that's a very real one, right? This is that fake transfer request. I would even include the fake email of an invoice in there, right? And highlighting that there's two ways here, right? One is they actually broke into the system, the email, and the second is that they spoofed the email, or they sent it from a typo squatting email that looks the same but isn't, right? So from the attacker's perspective, right, if my motive is financial, right, I want to be able to operate in these networks as long as I can without being detected, right? I want to be stealthy. I want to stay hidden, right? I want to be able to obviously, ransomware is not going to be very stealthy, right? But it's more of a smash and grab. But these others are going to be much more hidden type attacks in order to gain money off of the attack, right? They take that information, like from the info stealers, and they sell it on the dark web. How many people are not familiar with what the dark web is? How many people have heard of the dark web but don't really understand it? All right, that's a much greater number. So a lot of people have heard about it, right? You've probably heard, seen it in movies on the TV, kind of like our clips at the beginning, right? So the dark web is a series of internet sites. They're not accessible directly from the plain internet, right? You have to use an anonymity service called Tor, the Onion Router, which was actually developed by the US Navy, believe it or not, and as a research project, and is now used by a lot of folks to provide anonymous connection to internet sites. Well, they can host websites anonymously there as well. And because of the way the connection works, they can't directly trace where that web server is, right? They don't know where it's hosted, right? They don't know the source of the connections, right? That is why it's called the dark web, because you can't get to it from the regular internet directly. You have to use this Tor service to be able to access them, right? Because of the anonymity that it provides, the attackers use these sites to exchange information, to sell information. They have forums where they'll talk about their techniques. Well, they might offer to assist. Where if, hey, I've got wrong button. I've got 50,000 installations of adware in the Netherlands, and it's available for somebody to rent. For spam campaigns, for denial of service, to do whatever you want for 24 hours. The price is just whatever. $1,000, right? And it's surprisingly how cheap some of these can be just to rent some of this information, right? Credit cards on the dark web, can go for $4 or less each, right? So at this point, you're probably saying, wow, Eric, that's a lot of information, right? That's a lot of stuff for me to be worried about, right? From the different types of attacks to the attackers to, how do we defend against this, right? And if you're feeling a little overwhelmed, right, that's okay. If you look like one of these folks on the screen, that is okay, because it's not your primary job isn't cybersecurity, right? I mean, there's a few folks in here that it is, like me, right? But it's not a brand new problem, right? Just because it's relatively new to this industry, at least for this industry to recognize that it's an issue we have to consider and to be concerned about, right? Doesn't mean that it hasn't been thought about previously, right? There's a lot of folks who have been thinking about, hey, what is it that you can do, right? So the IMO, right, the International Maritime Organization, right, has put out through the Maritime Safety Committee some cybersecurity guidelines. Initially, they put them out, the first set out in 2016. They put out a revised set in 2017. And most recently, right, they are going to be implementing changes to the ISM that mandates that you have to have a cybersecurity policy as a part of your ship safety plan by January 1st, 2021, right? So the end of next year. So the IMO and the Maritime Safety Committee has thought about, hey, what is it that organizations have to do to try to be more secure? And they spelled out a 5-step process here. Identify. There we go. Identify, right? Define the roles and responsibilities for cyber risk management. Identify the systems. Identify the assets, the data, the capabilities. Anything that, when disrupted, could be a risk to ship operations, right? That's step one. You got to identify the risks, right? Step 2 is protect, right? The IMO says that you need to implement risk control processes and measures. You got to have some contingency planning to protect against a cyber event and ensure continuity of ship operations should a cyber attack occur, right? Detect is step 3. Detect is really, you need to develop and implement processes and activities necessary to identify the cyber attack in a timely manner, right? You don't want to be finding out about it 6 months later, right? Like we talked about earlier, the average dwell time for an attacker from the time they break into a system to the time that they get detected is about 6 months on average, right? Shorter if it's detected internally, closer to about 2, maybe 3 months. And if it's outside notification, it might be as long as 9 months, right? We want that to be much, much shorter, right? If an attacker is going to break in, I'd rather catch them in single-digit days, hours if I could, right? 6 months is obviously way too long, right? They're probably going to cause us some kind of harm at that point. The fourth step was respond, right? So respond. You have to develop and implement activities and plans to provide resiliency should an attack occur, right? And you got to be able to restore systems quickly to ensure ship operations. And finally, recover. And there's a slight nuance between the difference between respond and recover, right? So recover is more about identifying how to back up the systems, how to restore the systems necessary for ship operations should a cyber event occur. So respond is more about resiliency, and recover is more about restoring, if that makes sense. We could go further into each of these and break them out into smaller subcomponents, right? On each of the 5. Now, what's very interesting for me is that the 5 steps that the IMO has spelled out in their guidelines mirror the NIST cybersecurity framework, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology out of the US, their CSF, their cybersecurity framework pretty well. So there are auditing standards that exist today in order to help organizations implement these kinds of controls, right? You'll notice they're not all technical controls, right? There are policy procedures in here. We talk about governance. We talk about awareness and training, right? We talk about response planning. We talk about improvements, incorporating lessons learned. Of course, there is a very heavy technology piece, but the policies and procedures are required in order to do that as well. But the NIST standard is not the only one that's out there, right? We said the IMO thought about this. How many people are familiar with BIMCO? Right? I would assume, right? We're in a maritime conference, right? So one of the largest shipping organizations, right, with ship owners and such. They specify a 4-step process in their guidelines that ships should implement, right? Understand the threats, evaluate the risk, reduce the risk, develop contingency plans. And then they say, hey, there's a bunch of controls that you should implement in order to reduce this risk, and these are a listing of the controls, right? So some very technical measures, some direct measures that, hey, you should be addressing these items in order to be more secure and to better protect your ship from the cyber attacks. They also talk about, in the BIMCO guidelines, some procedural controls, such as crew training and awareness, software maintenance and upgrades, controlling admin privileges, updating antivirus, that kind of stuff as well. So in addition to NIST, CSF, which the IMO has kind of aligned to, the BIMCO guidelines, you also have a non-maritime specific, but more of a cyber-specific, cybersecurity-specific set of guidelines in the ISO 27001. Anybody familiar with this? I'm going to assume some of our cybersecurity folks and some of your security folks, because it's not just cybersecurity specific, right? I believe there's about 114 or so controls over a variety of security areas here, right? But one of which is information security policies, which then is broken out in 27002 into much more refined controls that can be implemented, right? These get updated pretty frequently, and their history goes back about 20 years, right? So this is a pretty popular one, especially in Europe and in Asia. The ISO 27001 standards tend to get referenced a little bit more. What's very, I would say, useful here as the receiver of supply services or of outside vendor services is you can actually, specify in contracts, right, that you want your vendor to be ISO 27001 compliant, right? And that they should have an audit within the last 5 years to help show that they're compliant, right? That this goes to how do we help alleviate some of the challenges of one of our supply chain getting hacked and our information getting stolen, right? If we know that they're implementing appropriate technical controls, security controls, and not just saying that, oh, yeah, we do that, but an outside auditor has come in and said, yes, we have validated against these controls, and yes, they're meeting it, right? Well, now you've got an external auditors come in and said, yep, they're adequately protecting your data, right? That is something that can be specified out in contracts. Of course, there's a discussion to be had with your supplier there, but it's an option, right? So you've got these guidelines that are out there, right? What is it that you really need to do then, right? You've got to identify who's responsible for security. You got to implement processes that help protect against cyber attackers. Okay, well, what processes do I need to implement? I should take a look again against the ISO 27001, the NIST CSF, the BIMCO guidelines, and ensure that we are executing those processes to combat the attackers. But it's going to take more than just processes, right? We got to have skilled people in order to do this, right? Does it make sense for us to add another 2 or 3 people on our yachts to do cybersecurity full time? Probably not, right? And so how do we do this? As organizations, right? If you're large enough, right? Maybe you want to invest in a security operations center that's monitoring your entire fleet, right? That can be a hefty investment, though, right? But it might make sense for you, right? A lot of folks are starting to turn to outsourcing their security operations center, right? Contracting with an organization who understands the threats, who can be basically an extension of your engineering team, of your ETO, of your IT specialists, and help you combat those threats as they occur. That way, you've got dedicated people who are skilled, who are well-trained, who are being continuously going through upgrade training, right? Who know about the latest threats, the greatest threats, and can be effective against those attackers because the attackers are continuously updating their techniques as well, right? An important point here: technology alone will not defeat the attackers, right? It might slow them down, right? But technology by itself will never be 100% effective, right? Because the advanced attacker knows that you're going to implement these different cybersecurity solutions. They know that, hey, you're going to get the latest firewall, and hopefully it's being monitored and managed correctly, right? They may know that you've got an IDS, an intrusion detection system or an intrusion prevention system installed and operating, right? They're going to try to figure out how do they get around those, right? And so any technology company, right, that says, yeah, our magic box will stop 100% of attacks is lying to you. Right, that's just not effective. It works great for them though, because it's high margin, low investment, right? But you have to have that combination, people, process, technologies, to really be effective. So, Security Operations Center, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that we run one, right? This will be the small part of the presentation that's a little self-serving, right? But Atlas Cybersecurity has a Security Operations Center 24/7 that we use to monitor our maritime, our Superyacht clients, as well as our small business clients, right? So whether it's a management company, a supplier, or a yacht itself, right? Our 24/7 SOC has analysts that are trained specifically to cyber threats and work with the organizations to understand their network, to provide that business context in order to provide the adequate level of protection, right? So whether this is something that you develop in-house, whether you outsource it to a company like Atlas or somebody else, right? I highly recommend organizations look at implementing a security operations center approach to protecting their networks and their organizations. Having that specialized team is important, though, right? You can't just say, hey, I've got an ETO, hey, on top of doing the AV and the IT and helping in the engine room when stuff's broken, you also got to do cybersecurity, right? Yeah, they might be your on-board point of contact for cybersecurity, but they're going to need help, right? They're not going to be able to do it by themselves. So, again, I'll say in the interest of just being forthright about what we do at Atlas, we decided that when we put this together, when we put together a maritime-specific, yacht-specific cyber service offering, that the only way to do it effectively was to collaborate with folks already in the industry. So we partnered with VBH, who has been doing AV IT installs in the superyacht industry since 1985, right? So they understand superyachts. We understand cybersecurity. We came together with them about the beginning of this year, said, hey, let's come up with a solution that's effective for super yachts, because a lot of times the commercial off-the-shelf solutions by themselves is not going to work in a plug-and-play fashion, right? If a cybersecurity solution says, hey, I've got to use a whole bunch of cloud infrastructure, and you're like, hey, my yacht is on VSAT most of the time, it probably isn't going to play too well together, right? And so we've come up with a solution that mitigates that as well, right? VBH has a booth out in Bay 11, right? So go visit VBH after this if you want to learn a little bit more about it. And again, my last kind of self-serving slide about our solution and our recommendation, right? I talked about IMO's recommendations. I talked about BIMCO's recommendations. I talked about ISO 27001, right? So what is the Atlas recommendation? Either start a SOC, hire a SOC, outsource a SOC, right? Find a cybersecurity service and solution that combines the three, people, process, technologies, in order to be effective against the attacker, right? It should be a solution that is designed to work well on yachts, right? And so that's exactly what we've done. We end up with a shallow depth 1U server that ends up on the boat that does a lot of the processing that some organizations would do in the cloud. We actually do on the boat. A lot of owners like it because that means their data stays on the boat in the sensor there. And we get alerts out to my SOC and then my analysts engage. From the threat intelligence perspective, we do provide threat intelligence feeds in there. We do incorporate, as Mike from the panel earlier would say, artificial intelligence. I call it anomaly identification, right? But to look for those unknown attacks, and those processes are pushed down here, right? Additionally, this is one component, the technology, combined with those processes, those people, and I would add auditing as the last piece of this in order to help ensure the compliance with the new ISM regulations, changes that are expected this coming year, and with the IMO mandates at the end of 2020, January 1st of 2021, right? The Maritime Safety Committee has another meeting scheduled for May, I believe, and I expect we're going to get even more details. I think you're going to see the different flag states are going to start advertising what are their requirements to meet those. I think if you look at the three, right, together, the IMO, NIST, CSF process, the BIMCO recommendations, and the ISO 27001, you've got a recipe for success, and you're probably going to address anything that any flag state's going to put out there, right? Awesome. Thank you all for your time. I appreciate it.